Hey guys, my name is Vishwas and welcome to a brand new tutorial series on Angular material. In this introductory video, let's take a look at what is Angular material, the prerequisites for this course, and also the course structure. Alright, let's begin. What is Angular material? Angular material is a UI component library. What that means is Angular material provides us with components to build awesome user interfaces in quick time. It is also an implementation of Google's material design specification. Just like how we have Material UI for React, Vuetify for Vue, we have Angular material for Angular. The goal here is to learn how to use the library components to build clean and elegant UI. Now before we get started, let me quickly run you through the prerequisites. As always, HTML, CSS and JavaScript go without saying. In addition to these, you also need to have a knowledge of Angular. You don't have to be an expert by any means, but some basic knowledge is absolutely necessary. If you're feeling rusty, make sure to go through the Angular tutorials on my channel before starting this course. Now, as of this recording, the current major version of Angular and Angular material is 7. With new releases, there might be minor tweaks, but what you will learn in this series will still hold good. So you can watch this entire series without any hesitation. Alright, how are we going to proceed with this course? First, we will learn how to add Angular material to an Angular application. Then we will discuss about typography in Angular. After that, we will take a look at the different components that make up the library. The components fall under 6 major categories. We have buttons and indicators, navigation, layout, form controls, pop-ups and modals, and finally data tables. We will not take a detailed look at every single one of them, but we will cover the important ones. By the end of this course, you will have a good understanding of how the individual Angular material components work. You can then use that knowledge to build Angular applications that suit your requirement. Alright then, let's get started in the next video. In this video, let's see how we can add Angular material to an Angular application. Now before I show you how to do that, I want to tell you that for this course, we will be closely looking at the documentation. And that is for 2 reasons. First one is to stay updated with the changes. There will be future releases of Angular material, and it is safe to rely on the documentation as it is constantly updated. The second reason is to know the directives that have to be used for the different components. When we start writing code, we need to import certain components, and it is next to impossible to know the component names without referring to the documentation. So make sure you have a tab open for the docs while you're following the videos. Alright, with that, let's see how to add Angular material to an Angular application. From the Navbar, I am going to navigate to the Guides section of the documentation. Here you can see the Getting Started heading as well as the Schematics heading. Both these sections contain information on how to install Angular material depending on the version of your Angular application. The Getting Started section contains about 6 different steps which you have to go through to set up material in your Angular application. And this is only if your project is below version 6. For this series, we will be working with Angular version 7. So I will demo how to add material with CLI schematics, which is valid for Angular version 6 and above. Now in the terminal, when I run the command ng-version, you can see that I have Angular CLI version 7. If you are at a lower version, please make sure to update it before creating a new project. Alright, now what I have done is created a brand new project using the command ng new material-demo. Material-demo is the name of the project we will be working with. And of course, I have opened that project folder in VS Code. Next, to set up Angular material, make sure you navigate into the project folder and run the command ng add @angular/material. When we run the command, it is going to ask us an option for the theme. I'm going to stick with Indigo Pink. Next, it checks with us for Hammer.js for gesture recognition. I will simply go with yes for now. Next, browser animations. Again, yes. And that is pretty much all you have to do. You are ready to start using Angular material in your application. Now this was possible because Angular material is packaged with CLI schematics. What that means is that the Angular team provided us with a single command that will handle setting up material in your application. Let's take a look at the differences to see what changes were made by running the command. First up, angular.json. The only difference is the inclusion of a CSS file in the styles array. And this is the Indigo Pink theme which we opted for. The next file is package.json. Here you can see that Angular CDK and Angular material have been added to the list of dependencies. Next, we also have updates to the package lock.json file. And then we have index.html. Here, two references have been added. One to material icons and the other to Roboto font. In main.ts, there is the inclusion of Hammer.js. In styles.css, there is some CSS reset that has been added to the body tag. Finally, in app.module.ts, we are importing the browser animations module and adding it to the imports array. Now, if you're doing this manually, make sure to add it after the browsers module. So the command basically adds project dependencies, includes them in the module, and sets up the style and theme for your Angular application. To test if it is actually working, let's use materials button component. There are three simple steps. First step, import it in app.module.ts. Import mat button module from Angular/material. Second step, add it to the imports array. Third step, use it in the HTML. So in app.component.html, wipe out the existing HTML and add a button tag with the text hello world, but also with the directive mat-button. Now let's run the application. In the terminal, run the command ng serve-o. In the browser, you can see that we have a button that says Hello World, which is styled with Angular material. Let me change the directive to mat raised button. Go back to the browser, and you can see the subtle difference. The button is now raised. So the material library is working perfectly fine. You're probably thinking, how would I know to use mat button or mat raised button, right? Well, it's pretty simple. I refer to the documentation. Like I mentioned, it is kind of a necessity for this particular course. There is just no way that we can know what directive has to be used for which component. This was a simple getting started video, and that is the reason I used a simple button component without referring to the documentation. In the upcoming videos, we will be referring the documentation more often. Alright, there you go. Angular material working in your Angular application. All we had to do was run the command ng add @angular/material in the CLI project. In the last video, we saw how to add a material button component to our application. There were 3 simple steps. First step is to import it. Second step is to add it to the imports array. And third step is to use it in the HTML. Although this is perfectly fine, there is a better recommended approach. And that approach is to create a separate module that deals with importing and exporting material components. So in the terminal, let us use the CLI to generate a new module. ng, G for generate, M for module, followed by name of the module, which we will call as material. Once the command completes, you should have a folder called material inside the app folder. And within the material folder, you should have material.module.ts. In this module, we are only concerned with importing and exporting material components. So remove common module as well as the declarations array. Instead, add an exports array. Now let's move the imports from app module to material module. So from app.module.ts, remove the import statement and add it in material module. Make sure to remove it from the imports array as well. Next, in material module, create a constant material components and then include the mat button module. Next, add this constant to the imports array and the exports array. Finally, include the material module in the app module. In the imports array, material module, which is going to auto import the material module from material.module.ts. Now let's restart the server. Control C and then ng serve-o. And you can see that the raised button still has the same material styling. So what we have done is extracted material into its own module. So from the next video, to use any component, all we have to do is import it and add it to the material components array. This approach isolates material code and also keeps the app module nice and clean. In this video, let's discuss about typography in Angular material. Now, typography basically deals with the style and appearance of text on your website. If your website has text content with way too many styles or font sizes, it kind of spoils the UI. To address this concern, Angular material provides typography levels. Each level has a definite font size, font weight, and line height. Let's take a closer look at the different typography levels. To create huge headers in the web page, we can make use of the material display classes. Now there are a total of 4 display classes, so let me create 4 div tags, 1 for each display class. In fact, let me simply copy paste the code and then explain it. So we have 4 div tags, each with a different class. The topmost one is mat display 4, mat display 3, 2, and 1. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see how they appear on the web page. Display 4 has the largest size and the size decreases as we move towards display 1. When you have to really capture the user's attention, this is probably the way to go. Next, we have 4 more classes that correspond to H1, H2, H3, and H4 tags for a section of your web page. Again, let me copy paste 4 more div tags. We have the mat headline class, which is for an H1 tag, mat title, which is equivalent to an H2 tag, subheading 2 for H3, and subheading 1 for H4. If you save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see the 4 classes in action. So these are also kind of headings, but smaller compared to the display classes. The display classes you probably use only once at the very top of your page, and the section headings like headline can be used multiple times, once for each section. Alright, next we have body text and caption. Again, let me copy paste the div tags. So for the body content in your page, that is for text other than headings, you can make use of body 1. And if you need the text to be in bold, use body 2. And if there is a caption, use the caption class. So mat body 1, mat body 2, and mat caption. If you take a look at the browser, you can see them in action. Body 1, body 2, which is bold text, and then the caption. Now the final class we have is the typography class itself. And what it does is it allows H1 to H4 tags to be used as you would normally. You just have to wrap them in material typography class. Again, let me quickly copy paste the div tags. So you can see that we have a div tag with class mat typography, and then within this div tag we can use the regular H1 to H4 tags. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that it is exactly the same as headline, title, and subheading classes. So this is about typography in Angular material, a set of classes concerned with the style and appearance of text in your application. In the next video, let's discuss about one of the most fundamental HTML elements, which is the button element. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you guys in the next one. In this video, let's take a look at Angular material buttons. Angular material buttons are basically native button tags or anchor tags enhanced with material design. We had a quick look at material buttons in the Getting Started video. Now let's take a more detailed look. To make use of material buttons, we need to import the material button module. So in material.module.ts, import the mat button module and add it to the material components array. Now let's go back to app.component.html. To create the simplest of material buttons, we add the mat button attribute. So a button tag with the mat button attribute. Save this and take a look at the browser, and you can see a material button. Now let's take a look at some of the variants. The first variant is a raised button. The attribute is mat raised button. The next variant is a flat button. The attribute is mat flat button. And we also have a variant that applies just the outline. The attribute is mat stroked button. Let's save this and take a look at the browser. The buttons are too close to each other, so let's add some margin. In app.component.css, margin right 3 rem. Now if you go back to the browser, you can see the different buttons: raised, flat, and stroked. Apart from these, we also have circular buttons in Angular material. There are again 3 variants. The first one is an icon button. The attribute is mat icon button. The second variant is a fab button. The attribute is mat fab. Lastly, a minifab button with the attribute mat minifab. Save the file and let's take a look at them in the browser. So we have icon button, which is a circular button with a transparent background. Fab button, which is a circular button which defaults to accent color of your theme. And the minifab button, which is just a smaller version of the fab button. So these are the variants for circular buttons. Next, let's talk about button colors. When it comes to material, there are three colors we talk about: primary, accent, and warn colors. W-A-R-N, warn. To apply the color, we make use of the color attribute on the button element. Let me copy paste three buttons and add the colors. Color is equal to primary. The text is primary. Color is equal to accent. The text is accent. And finally, color is equal to warn. And the text is warn. If we take a look at the browser, you can see the button text in different colors: primary, accent, and warn. How the colors apply are based on the variant of the button. If we were to apply the same colors to raised buttons, for example, you can see the difference: primary, accent, and warn. So based on the type of the button, the color is added to the element. The last thing I want to show is how to disable the ripple effect. Right now, you can see that when I click on the button, there is a ripple animation effect. If you don't like it for some reason, you can add the disable ripple attribute to the button element. So on this third button, which is for warn, I am going to add disable ripple. If I save this and go back to the browser, only on this button, when I click, you can see that there is no more ripple effect. Ripple effect, no ripple effect. Now, those were a lot of attributes to keep in mind, so let me point you to the documentation. Go to material.io and click on components, and then scroll to the button component. Click on examples and click on the code icon. Here you pretty much have all the code required for you to experiment with material buttons. And if you visit the API tab, you can see what is the module that needs to be imported. So, Angular Material provides 6 variants and 3 colors that can be applied to the native button element. Buttons kind of make up a part of few other material elements, so make sure you have a good knowledge of them. With this understanding, let's take a look at button toggle in the next video. Alright guys, let's take a look at the button toggle element in this video. Button toggle is basically an element with the appearance of a button and can toggle between on and off states. To get started, we need to import mat button toggle module from Angular Material and add it to the material array. Import it and add it to the material components array. Now in the HTML, we can add mat button toggle with the text toggle. If we save the file and take a look at the browser, you should see a toggle button. Click on the button, it toggles to the on state. Click again and it toggles to the off state. Now, you might want to use the state of the toggle button to perform some operation. To get hold of the toggle state, add a template reference variable and then access the checked property on that variable. Toggle button is going to be the template reference variable. and then interpolate toggle button dot checked. If you now take a look at the browser, you can see that the value is false. Click on the button and the value is true. Now the button checked value is false by default. We can change that though by adding the checked attribute to the toggle button element. If you now take a look at the browser, you can see that the button appearance is that of the on state and the checked property value is now true. We of course still have the ripple effect when we click on the button. To disable it, add the disable ripple attribute. You can see that the ripple animation is now gone. It is also possible to disable the button itself by adding the disabled attribute. If I now head back to the browser and try clicking on the button, nothing happens. The button is disabled and cannot be toggled between on and off. Alright, these are some of the properties on a button toggle element. Now, although these elements can be used individually, they are typically grouped together and presented as better alternatives to radio buttons or checkboxes. For example, let's say you have a list of front-end technologies. Let me show you how to display them using the button toggle element. To create a group of button toggle elements, we use the mat button toggle group directive. Within the group, we can add the individual button toggle elements. Angular, React, and Vue. Each of the elements need to have a value attribute which will point to the overall value of this group. So value is equal to Angular, React, and Vue. Now to access this group's value, we need to create a template reference variable and assign mat button toggle group. The variable name is toggle group, and to this we assign mat button toggle group. Now we can interpolate toggle group dot value to access the value of this toggle button group. Let's save this and head to the browser, and you can see that we have the button group. I click on the button and the group value is displayed: Angular, React, and Vue. By default, the toggle group behaves like radio buttons and only one item can be selected at a time. If you want the behavior to be that of a checkbox where multiple items can be selected, you simply need to add the multiple attribute to the toggle group element. So over here, I'm going to add multiple. If you now go back to the browser, you can see that we can select multiple elements and the value is now a comma separated list of the selections. Angular, React, Vue, just Angular and React, just Angular, or all three. Now what we have seen is how to get hold of the value in the HTML. You can also listen to change events and execute some code written in the component class as well. You can also get hold of the template reference variable in the class component and perform any required operation. I do have a small series on Angular component interaction where I go in detail about using reference variables within the component class. So please do take a look at that if you have a necessity. But this is pretty much how you work with the button toggle element in Angular material. In this video, let's take a look at the simplest way to use Angular material icons. First, make sure you have a link to material icons in your index.html. This right here. Next, import the mat icon module from Angular material and add it to the material components array. By including mat icon module, we can now use the mat icon component. So in the HTML, mat icon. In between the opening and closing tags, we need to specify text that corresponds to an icon. But the question is, what text do we specify? The mat icon component accepts material icon fonts. So in the browser, go to material.io/tools/icons, and here you can see all the material fonts available. You simply grab the text from one of the icons and paste it as the inner HTML to the mat icon tag. If you now go back to the browser, you should see the icon being displayed. So you can select any icon from the list and just include the text in the mat icon component. To add a color, we use the color attribute with either primary, accent, or worn as a value, which is retrieved based on your theme. So if I add color is equal to primary, go back to the browser, you should see the icon with the primary color, which in our case is indigo. Now you can also use your own SVGs, and there is a detailed explanation on how to use them as well. So if you go to the material docs, components, under buttons and indicators, there is icon, and over here there is a good amount of explanation on using SVGs. But then again, material font has tons of icons, which might be more than enough. Let's take a look at material badges in this video. If you've worked with Bootstrap, badges should seem familiar to you. They are basically small status descriptors for UI elements. For example, if you have to display notifications for a user or the number of unread messages in your inbox, badges are the way to go. So let's see what is possible with Angular material badges in this video. To be able to use them, we first need to import the badge module. In material.module.ts, import mat badge module from angular/material/badge, and then add it to the material components array. Now let's create our first badge. In app.component.html, I'm going to include a span tag with the text notifications. To add a badge to the span tag, we make use of the mat badge attribute. So mat badge, and this attribute is equal to the value you want to indicate. Let's go with 5. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you should see the badge in action. The small circular element on the top right of the span text. Now this is the most basic badge you can have. Let's see how to customize this. And let's start with the position. By default, a badge is placed above and after the element it is associated with. That is to the top right. We can control the position using the mat badge position attribute. So back in the HTML, I'm going to make 3 more copies of this div tag. And I'm going to specify the mat badge position attribute. Below and before, below and after, above and before. Let me also add some margin to the div tags to make sure that there is enough spacing between the elements. So div margin 3 rems. Now if you save the files and take a look at the browser, you can see the different positions. Above and after, below and before, below and after, above and before. So mat badge position attribute to control the position of the badge. Next, let's talk about badge sizing. We can specify the size using the mat badge size attribute. The possible values are small, medium, and large, with medium being the default value. I'm going to make 3 more copies of our notification badge. And for the first one, I'm going to add mat badge size is equal to small. The second one, medium, which is also the default. And for the third one, large. If you now save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see the badges which are small, medium, and large. Alright, next we have badge coloring. The badge background color can be set using the mat badge color attribute. Possible values are primary, accent, and worn, with primary being the default value. The color, of course, is determined by the theme your application is using. So back in VS Code, I'm going to make 3 more copies of the original notification badge. For the first one, I'm going to add mat badge color is equal to primary, which is the default. For the second one, it is going to be accent. And for the third one, it's going to be worn. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see primary, accent, and worn colors based on your theme. Now you might have noticed in all the notification badges, the badge overlaps with the text. The overlap flag though can be controlled as well. We specify the mat badge overlap attribute and set it to false. So back in VS Code, on the last badge, I'm going to add the attribute mat badge overlap is equal to false. If you go back to the browser, you can see that the badge doesn't overlap with the text anymore. In fact, material documentation advises us to overlap badges for icons and not for text. For example, if you have the inbox icon, then overlapping might be a good choice. For text, however, try avoiding overlap as much as possible. Finally, let's talk about binding values and also conditional rendering. The value for a badge is usually stored in a class property. To bind the value, we simply use property binding. So I'm going to open app.component.ts. And over here, I'm going to create a new property. Notifications is equal to 2. And then in the HTML, on the very first badge, I'm going to have property binding on the mat badge attribute. So square brackets for property binding. And the property we want to bind to is notifications. This property right here. So now if we go back to the browser, the very first badge now indicates 2. Now sometimes you might also want to conditionally render based on the number of notifications. For example, when notifications is 0, it doesn't really make sense to indicate that. We rather hide the badge itself. We can do that using mat badge hidden attribute. So back in app component, I'm going to add the condition property binding with mat badge hidden. And this is going to be equal to the condition notifications is equal to 0. Now, if we take a look at the browser, you can still see the badge 2. Go back to VS Code, change the value to 0, and you can see that the badge is now hidden. That is how you conditionally render a badge in Angular Material using the mat badge hidden attribute. Alright, that's pretty much what I have about badges. Let me quickly point you to the documentation. So go to material.io, components, under buttons and indicators, there is badge. And if you go to the API tab, you will know what has to be imported. Let's take a look at the progress spinner in this video. First, let's import the module, Math Progress Spinner module, included in the material components array. Now this module basically provides us with two spinner components, Math Progress Spinner and Math Spinner. The first one, Math Progress Spinner, is a determinate spinner which has a value attribute that can be between 0 and 100. So Math Progress Spinner with the value attribute is equal to, let's go with 40. If we take a look at the browser, you can see a spinner that is at 40% value. We can also specify the value as 0, in which case you cannot see any spinner at all, and a value of 100, which shows the complete spinner. You can also bind to the value attribute programmatically to indicate any progress that has to be conveyed to the user. Now, a more common use case of the spinner is the indeterminate spinner, or the spinner that never stops spinning. For that, we make use of the Math Spinner component. If we now save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a progress spinner that spins indefinitely. You would want to use this to indicate to the user that something is running in the background and the UI is busy. For example, if you are loading data, it is a good idea to show the spinner and then hide it when the data has loaded. Let me mock the loading of data with a button click. So I'm going to go back to app.component.ts and create a new property, show spinner, and initialize it to false. I'm also going to define a method, load data, and in this method, initially we are going to set show spinner to true. This .show spinner is equal to true. And then we use set timeout to set it back to false after 5 seconds. So arrow function, this .show spinner is equal to false. In the HTML, let me use the ngIf condition with show spinner and also create a button that calls the load data method. ngIf is equal to show spinner and a button load data. On click, this is going to be load data. Now let's go back to the browser, and initially you can see that the spinner is hidden. I click on load data and the spinner appears. This indicates to the user the data is being fetched, and after 5 seconds the spinner disappears, which again can indicate that the data has been loaded. Now ideally you want a separate component with more styling like an overlay and a z-index so that nothing else can be clicked when data is being loaded or even a form being submitted. And also by default the color is set to primary color of the theme, but again, like other components, you can set the color attribute to accent or warn as well. So Math Spinner color is equal to accent. And now we have an accent color spinner. So that is about the progress spinner. Now similar to the progress spinner, there is also the progress bar indicator in Angular material. It works almost the same as progress spinner, so I will leave it up to you guys to experiment and understand how it works. Well, that is about buttons and indicators in Angular material. From the next video, let's take a look at the different components related to navigation. Let's take a look at navigation components, starting with the toolbar. Typically, the toolbar displays information and actions relating to the current screen. It's used for branding, screen titles, navigation, and actions. In this video though, we will only focus on how the toolbar can be used as a navbar. Now the first step is to import the material toolbar module in material.module.ts. In the import statement, add matte toolbar module, also included in the material components array. Now that I think of it, the array name is slightly misleading. So I'm going to replace material components with the name just material. Alright, now that we have imported the module, we can use the component in the HTML. So in app.component.html, the component is matte toolbar. Within the toolbar, I'm going to add a span tag that says code evolution. If you now save this and take a look at the browser, you should be able to see a basic toolbar. We can add a color to this toolbar using the color attribute. The color attribute accepts either primary, accent, or warn as its value. Let's go with primary. If you head back to the browser, you should be able to see a primary colored toolbar in your application. Now let's see how to convert this basic toolbar into a navbar. A navbar typically consists of the brand title on the left and a group of links on the right. I'm going to convert our span tag into a div tag, which is going to be our brand, code evolution. We're also going to add another div tag with a set of links. I'm going to add 3 span tags, one for home, one for about, and one for services. If you save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see that it doesn't exactly look like a navbar. But all we need is to distribute the space in the toolbar in between the title and the links. So in the CSS, which is app.component.css, I'm going to add a class navbar and specify justify content to be space between. Let me also add some spacing between the span tags. Padding right 1 rem. Finally, add the navbar class to the toolbar. So in app.component.html, on the matte toolbar component, class is equal to navbar. Now, if we take a look at the browser, you should have a proper navbar. Brand on the left and a set of links on the right. Now the styling is completely up to you, but a toolbar is what you need to use to create a navbar in Angular material. In this video, let's take a look at Sidenav in Angular material. The first step, as always, is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, import matte Sidenav module and add it to the material array. Now we can add the Sidenav to our application. To set up a Sidenav, we use 3 components. The first one is matte Sidenav container, which acts as a container to the Sidenav as well as the main content. Within the container, we have matte Sidenav, which represents the site content, and then we have matte Sidenav content, which represents the main content. It is important that the site content and the main content are placed within the container. If you don't want some elements to be affected by this container, for example, header and footer, you can place them outside the Sidenav container. Alright, if we now save the file and take a look at the browser, the output is not quite what we expect. We can see the main content, but the Sidenav is not seen. Let me tell you that this is the expected behavior. Sidenav is always hidden by default. There are a couple of ways to open or show the Sidenav. The simplest way is to add the opened attribute on the matte Sidenav component. If you now save the file and take a look at the browser, you should be able to see the Sidenav as well. The UI though is not clear, so let me add some basic styling. Back in VS Code in app.component.css, I'm going to add mat Sidenav container has a height of 100%. Mat Sidenav and mat Sidenav content. Let's add some padding. And finally, just for the Sidenav, I'm going to add a background color, light coral, and a width of 200 pixels. If we now take a look at the browser, it is much more clear. The Sidenav appears like an overlay on the main content, and when I click outside the Sidenav, it closes and we can see the main content. Now, once we close it though, there is no way to open it again. So rather than setting the opened attribute, like here, let's bind it to a property which we can then control using a button. We will be using two-way binding, so the first step is to import the forms module in app module. So open app.module.ts, import forms module, and add it to the imports array. Now let's go back to two-way binding. In app.component.ts, which is the component class, I'm going to create a new property called opened and set it to false. Next, in the HTML, bind the opened attribute to the opened property and create a button that will toggle the opened property value. So for two-way binding, we use banana in a box syntax. So square brackets, parentheses, and close it. Now this is going to be equal to the property we just created, opened. Next, as part of the main content, I'm going to add a button. The text is going to be toggle opened, and on click of this button, so click handler, we simply toggle the opened value. Opened is equal to not of opened. If we now save the files and take a look at the browser, the Sidenav should be initially hidden because we have initialized it to false. I click on the button and the Sidenav is shown. Click outside the Sidenav and it automatically hides. So this is the first method to show or hide the Sidenav. Before we take a look at the next method, I want to quickly show you the different modes that can be applied to a Sidenav. The mode for a Sidenav can be specified using the mode attribute on the mat Sidenav component. The default mode is over. Mode is equal to over. And this is the mode we have seen so far. If we go back to the browser, you can see that there is no change from what we have already seen. The Sidenav floats over the main content, which is covered by a backdrop. The second possible value for the mode attribute is push. So I'm going to change over to push. Let's see how this works in the browser. I click on the button. The Sidenav appears, but this time the Sidenav pushes the primary content out of its way, covering it with a backdrop. Now the final possible mode is side. So mode is equal to side. In this mode, the Sidenav appears side by side with the main content, shrinking the main content's width to make space for the Sidenav. So the three possible modes are over, push, and side. I'm going to stick with side for the rest of this video. Now back to opening and closing the Sidenav. We have seen the first method, which is using the opened attribute. The second way to open or close the Sidenav is by invoking the open or close methods on the Sidenav itself. For this method, I will create a template reference variable on the mat Sidenav component. Hash symbol and Sidenav. Now I can create two buttons that will call the open and close methods on this template reference variable. Button open. On click, it is going to call Sidenav.open. Similarly, button close. On click, Sidenav.close. Let's save this file and go back to the browser. I click on open and the Sidenav opens. I click on close and the Sidenav closes. So this is the second method. The third method is to simply toggle the Sidenav by calling the toggle method. This is also the approach you might want to take when you have a hamburger icon, for example. I will create another button in the main content, and the text is going to be toggle. On click of this button, I simply call the toggle method on the Sidenav reference variable, Sidenav.toggle. If I now go back to the browser, click on the toggle button, it opens. I click again, it closes. So these are the three methods. And if at all you want to perform some action on open or close of the Sidenav, you can listen to the opened and closed events. Now back in VS Code in app.component.ts, I am going to create a method called log, which accepts a parameter called state and simply logs that to the console. Now in the HTML, we can listen to opened and closed events and call our log method passing in the appropriate value. So on mat Sidenav, listen to opened event and call the log method passing in the string opened. Similarly, on the closed event, call the method passing in the string closed. If we now head back to the browser, open DevTools, click on toggle, you should see the message opened. Toggle again, you should see the message closed. Now I am simply logging a message, but you can perform any action that seems fit for your application. So that is about the Sidenav in Angular Material. Alright, let's take a look at menus in this video. Basically, a menu displays a list of choices on a temporary surface. The choices appear when users interact with the button, action, or some other type of control. Now, as always, the first step is to import the appropriate module. So in material.module.ts, I'm going to import mat menu module and add it to the material array. Now let's go to app.component.html, and over here to create a menu we use the mat menu component. To specify the choices for a menu, we use the button elements with a mat menu item attribute. Button, front end is the text, and we add the mat menu item attribute. Similarly, let's also have backend as a menu item. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you're not going to see anything. That is because by itself, the mat menu element does not render anything. It has to be triggered from a UI element or programmatically. So let's add an element to open the menu. I'm going to add a button element and add the attribute mat flat button for some styling. The text is going to be menu. Now that we have the element, we need to associate the menu with this element. And that is a quick two-step process. First step, on the mat menu component, create a template reference variable and assign to it the mat menu directive. App menu is the variable name, and assign mat menu. Second step, link the button with the template reference variable using the mat menu trigger for directive. So on this button, mat menu trigger for, and then assign the reference variable, app menu. In simple English, hey, there is a menu called app menu which can be triggered by this menu button. Now, if we save the file and take a look at the browser, we have the menu button. Click on the button and you can see the menu. So this is how you create a basic menu. Next, let's see how to create a nested menu. The first step is to create the submenu. And we are going to repeat the process of creating a menu and attaching a template reference variable. So mat menu, I'm going to add 3 menu items. The first one is going to be Angular, the second one React, and the third one Vue. On the mat menu component, I'm going to add the reference variable. This is going to be called submenu, and we assign the mat menu directive. Alright, we have created a submenu. Now this is a submenu for the front end choice in the main menu. So all we have to do is add the trigger directive again. On this item, mat menu trigger for submenu. In simple English, hey, this front-end menu choice is going to trigger this submenu. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have the nested menu. You don't have to click on front-end. When you hover on the choice, the submenu is opened. Angular, React, and Vue. Now, one of the useful options when it comes to a menu is with respect to the positioning of the menu. We have X position and Y position attributes. So on the mat menu component, we can specify X position and Y position. X position can take values of before or after, and Y position can take values of above or below. Let's go with after and above. If we take a look at the browser, click on menu, you can see that the menu opens to the right, so X position is working fine, but the menu still opens below the button. And that is simply because there is no space available at the top. Let's reposition the button. In the CSS file, let me add a class center. The margin is going to be 10 rems. Back in the HTML, let's add the class to the button element. Now, if we go back to the browser and click on the element, you can see that the menu opens to the right and to the top. So X position and Y position. Before, after for X position, above and below for Y position. These attributes control the position of the menu. Now the last thing I want to talk about is lazy rendering. By default, the menu choices are initialized even before the menu is opened. That is, even before clicking on the menu button, the choices have already been set for the menu. We can defer initialization until the menu is open using the ngTemplate directive and mat menu content attribute. This allows us to have dynamic content as menu choices. Let's see how. I'm going to create a new menu. Mat menu, I'm going to add a reference variable called lazy menu and set it to mat menu. Within the menu component, we are going to use the ngTemplate directive. And within this directive, we specify the menu items. The first one is going to be a settings button, and the second one is going to be the text logout. Now what I am going to do is create two trigger buttons to this same menu. Button, the text is going to be Vishwas. Mat menu trigger for is equal to lazy menu. Similarly, another button that says code evolution, and we trigger the same lazy menu. If we now save the file and take a look at the browser, if I click on Vishwas, the menu is not quite opening, and that is because we left out the mat menu content attribute on the ng template tag. So let's save the file and try again. I'm going to go back to the browser, click on Vishwas, and you can see we have the menu. Click on code evolution, and you can see that we have the same menu again. Now what we want is, if I click on Vishwas, I need the choice to be logout Vishwas. And if I click on code evolution, I want the menu to say logout code evolution. Basically, we are looking at dynamic choices. For that, we make use of mat menu trigger data attribute. So back in the component HTML, on the trigger buttons, we add in an extra attribute. This attribute is mat menu trigger data. This is going to be equal to an object. Let's pass in a name, which is Vishwas. Similarly, on the second trigger button, we're going to pass in name, but this time it is going to be code evolution. Now I've just reformatted this, and we have the two buttons still in place. One for Vishwas and one for code evolution. Now that we have specified the data, on the ng template tag, we create a local variable. Let name is equal to name. And in the menu choice, we can now use interpolation with that variable. Double curly braces and name. Now if we go back to the browser, click on Vishwas, it says logout Vishwas, and if I click on code evolution, it says logout code evolution. So what is happening is, on the trigger button, we specify the mat menu trigger data attribute, and we specify the name. So we are saying, hey, I know that this button is a trigger for a menu, but when I am triggering that menu, let me pass some additional information that the menu can use to dynamically render some data. Now in the mat menu component, we use the ng template tag, and on the ng template tag, we specify this name variable that we want to access, and that can be interpolated in the button element. That is how we have logout Vishwas. Let's add one more property so that we really understand how it works. To the trigger data object, I'm going to add a new property called hobby. For Vishwas, the hobby is football. And for code evolution, the hobby is teaching. Now in the menu, on the ng template tag, we declare another variable. Let hobby is equal to hobby. And now we can add a new menu choice and bind the hobby. So button hobby is bind hobby. And let me also add mat menu item. If we now save the file and take a look at the browser, click on Vishwas, hobby is football. Click on code evolution, hobby is teaching. You can see that we have different menu choices for the two elements. Same menu, but dynamic content. Alright, that is about navigation and menus in Angular material. Let me quickly point you to the documentation. Go to components, go to navigation, menu, API for the module that you have to import, and then the examples to take a look at some of the examples you can use. In the next section, let's take a look at components related to layouts in Angular material. Angular material provides a number of components for laying out elements. Let's begin with the list component in this video. First step is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, import mat_list module and add it to the material array. Now in the HTML, we can create a basic list. mat_list is the component, and this component has mat_list item as its children. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a list of items being displayed. Now suppose you have a list where the list item is just a lot of text. For such scenarios, we have the dense attribute. Apply it on the mat_list component and it will reduce the font size. If we take a look at the browser, you can see that the font size has been reduced. The mat_list module also provides components to create a navigation list. The component is mat_nav_list. As children to this component, you have to specify anchor tags with the mat_list item attribute. So anchor tag, mat_list item attribute, and let's just add href is equal to a hashtag. I'm going to create two more list items, about and services. If we save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a navigation list. A good place for this would be the Sidenav component, which we learned earlier in the series. Now it is also possible to create multi-line lists and also include material icons. I'm going to comment this out and start a new list. So mat_list. And within the mat_list component, we are going to have a mat_list item. Within the list item, we can add a material icon. Mat icon, and let's go with home. We can then add a heading with mat line attribute. After that, a paragraph with a mat line attribute. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that the list item has two lines, one for heading and one for the paragraph. We also have the icon, and it looks like I've forgotten the attribute on mat icon, so let's add mat_list icon. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that the list item has two lines, one for heading and one for the paragraph. We also have the icon to the left. Let me add another list item. I'm going to copy this mat_list item component, paste it. I'm going to change home to folder. This is going to be heading 2 and then line 2. Save the file and take a look at the browser. We have two items in the list which contain multiple lines. Now you can see that we don't really have a clear distinction between the list items. For that purpose, Angular Material provides another module, namely mat divider module. So in material.module.ts, let's import it and then add it to the material array. Mat divider module. Now in the HTML, in between the two list items, we can add the mat divider component. So right after the first list item, mat divider. Now if we take a look at the browser, you can see that there is a clear separation between the list items. Right now we have the list items hard-coded, but typically you would use the ng_for directive on an array of data. So to create lists, you can use the mat_list and mat divider modules. Let's take a look at grids in the next video. Alright, let's take a look at the material grid list in this video. The grid list is basically a two-dimensional list view that arranges cells into grid-based layout. Now the first step is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, import mat grid list module and add it to the material array. Mat grid list module. Now we can create a grid list. The component is mat grid list. And this component requires a calls attribute which specifies the number of columns in the grid. Let's go with 2 columns. So calls is equal to 2. As children to this component, we specify mat grid tile components. Tile 1, and similarly, let's create 3 more. Also, to be able to clearly see the grid, let's add a background color to the tiles. So in the CSS file, mat grid tile, background color, light blue. Now if we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see the grid with 2 columns and 2 rows. The question is, how did it create the 2 rows? For a grid, we always specify the number of columns, and the number of rows is determined by how many columns we want and the number of tiles specified. Since we have 4 tiles and 2 columns, it can fit only 2 tiles in each row. Hence, it creates an additional row to fit the next 2 tiles. If we were to have 5 tiles, there would be 3 rows. So the number of rows is determined by some basic math. Of course, you can also specify how many rows or columns each tile should take up. That can be specified using the row span and call span attributes. On tile 1, if I set row span is equal to 2 and take a look at the browser, you can see that it takes up 2 rows instead of 1. Similarly, if I set call span is equal to 2, you can see that it takes up 2 columns instead of 1. When specifying call span though, you need to make sure that it does not exceed the calls attribute. If it does, it throws an error. Alright, next let's talk about the height of each row in the grid. By default, the height of a row is equal to the width of a column. However, you can override this using the row height attribute. And you can specify one of the 3 values. The first one is a straightforward value. So row height is equal to 100 pixels. Take a look at the browser and you can see that each row will be 100 pixels tall. The second option is to specify the row height as a ratio with respect to the column width. For example, row height is equal to 2:1. This implies that the row height is half the column width. If the column width is 200 pixels, then the row height is 100 pixels. Take a look at the browser and you can clearly see from each tile that the height looks half the width. The third option is to fit the height based on the container. So row height is equal to fit, but this time we also need to specify a height for the container. So style height 200 pixels. Now if we take a look at the browser, the rows are fit into the container height of 200 pixels. So each row has a height of 100 pixels. If there were 4 rows, each row would be 50 pixels so as to fit the total container height of 200 pixels. Alright, the last attribute I want to discuss on a grid list is the gutter size. That is, spacing between the tiles. We can specify gutter size using the gutter size property. Let's go with gutter size is equal to 10 pixels. If we save the file and take a look at the browser, You should now see additional spacing between the different tiles. Welcome back everyone. In this video, let's take a look at expansion panels and accordions in Angular material. Expansion panels are basically panels which can collapse or expand to display additional details in a view. Let's take a look at some examples. To get started, import mat expansion module and add it to the material array. So in material.module.ts, import it and add it to the material array. Now in the HTML, let's create an expansion panel. The component to use is mat expansion panel. Every panel must contain a panel header component. It is this header which is displayed when the panel is collapsed. A header can contain a title and a description. We use mat panel title to add the title Angular Fundamentals and mat panel description to add a short description for the panel. Total duration 3 hours. If we now save the file and take a look at the browser, we should have an expansion panel. You can see the title and the description as well. When I click on the header, the panel expands. Right now, the panel content is empty. Let's go back and add some text. Outside the header, but within the expansion panel, I'm going to add a paragraph. This is the panel content, add course details. Material also provides an action row component, which I'm going to add here. Mat action row, a button tag with the text enroll, and mat button attribute. If we now take a look at the browser, we have the panel. I click on the header and we have the panel content, a paragraph tag, and the action row which floats the enroll button to the right. The panel details can be any HTML you wish to and is not limited to a paragraph tag. But this is pretty much how you create a basic expansion panel with Angular material. Next, let's take a look at creating accordions. An accordion is basically multiple expansion panels grouped together. Let's start off by duplicating the existing panel and changing the header and the description. I will change the title to Angular Material and the total duration to 2 hours. I will leave the content and action row as is. If we now take a look at the browser, we should have 2 panels. The 2 panels though work independently of each other. Let's add the mat accordion component to convert these panels into an accordion. So back in VS Code, I'm going to add the mat accordion component, and the 2 expansion panels are children of this component. If we now take a look at the browser, we still have the 2 panels, but this time when you try to expand the second panel, the first one collapses automatically. The accordion also adds a bit of margin between the panels which would otherwise not be present. Now, if at all you want multiple panels to be shown at the same time, you can set multi is equal to true on the mat accordion component. If we take a look at the browser, you can see that we can now expand both the panels at the same time. And if you notice, to the right of the panel header, we have the toggle icon. If at all, for some reason, you want to hide this, simply add the hide toggle attribute on the accordion. Hide toggle. Take a look at the browser. Now it is hidden. Now there are a couple of methods which could be useful depending on your requirement, so I will leave them for you to explore. The methods are pretty much like what we have already seen in some of the other components. There are methods to open or close the panels programmatically, and also events to know when a panel is expanded or collapsed. But this is pretty much the gist on how to create expansion panels and accordions with Angular material. The next layout component we are going to talk about is cards. A card is a container for content and actions about a single topic. First step, as always, is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, we are going to import mat card module and add it to the material array. Now we can create a basic card in the HTML. The component is mat-card, and I'm going to add the text basic card. If you take a look at the browser, you should be able to see a basic card. Now Angular material provides a few predefined sections that can be used inside this mat card component. Let's take a look at them. At the top, we usually have a card title. So we are going to add mat card title with the text card title. After that, we have the text content displayed using the card content section. So mat card content, and I'm going to add the text. This is the card content. And finally, at the bottom, we have a section for user actions. For example, button clicks. The component is mat card actions component. And within the tags, I'm going to add a button that says login, and I'm going to add mat flat button attribute. Now, if we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have the title, the content, and the action section. Now, if you want the button right aligned, we can do so using the align attribute on the actions section. Align is equal to end. Now take a look at the browser, and you can see that the action section is right aligned. Now this is the basic idea behind cards. There are a couple more sections with which you can truly build any card layout that you wish to. So let me point you to the documentation. In Components, under Layout, Card, and then under Examples, you can see a full-fledged application of a card. It has a header with an avatar, title, subtitle, an image, content, and actions. You can also build your own cards for a registration form, a login form, pricing section, user profiles, and a lot more. One component to fulfill a variety of requirements. Now, if you want the code for this particular card, just click on View Source and you have the HTML. In this video, let's take a look at tabs in Angular material. Tabs basically allow you to organize content into separate views where only one view can be visible at a given time. Now first up, let's import the tabs module. So in material.module.ts, we're going to import mat tabs module and add it to the material array. Now we can create tabs in the HTML. The component is mat tab group. And within the opening and closing tags, each tab is represented using the mat tab component. Each tab will have a label and the content. Let's add the labels Angular, React, and Vue. And the content as Angular content, React content, and Vue content. Now, if you save the files and take a look at the browser, you should see 3 tabs, one each for Angular, React, and View. If you want to know which tab is active at any point of time, you can use the selected index property. So back in the HTML, add a template reference variable on mat tab group, and then we can use interpolation to view the property value. tabref.selectedIndex. If you take a look at the browser, you can see that initially it displays 0 because index starts from 0. Click on React, it changes to 1, and View changes to 2. Now, if you want to perform some operation when you're changing tabs, you can listen to the selected tab change event. So back in the HTML, bind to selected tab change, and as an event handler, let's call log change and pass in the selected index. In the component class, I'm going to simply log the index to the console. Now, if we go back to the browser, open the console, and change the index, you can see the selected index being logged. So when the tab changes, you can perform any operation you want to using the selected tab change event. The last layout related component we are going to take a look at is the stepper component. Steppers basically convey progress through numbered steps. Let's take a look at an example. First step, import mat stepper module and add it to the material array. Now we can create our stepper in the HTML. There are two types of steppers, horizontal and vertical. First, let's take a look at the horizontal stepper and later on switch to the vertical stepper. To create a horizontal stepper, we use the mat horizontal stepper component. Within this component, to specify the individual steps, we use the mat step component. For each step, we specify the label using the label attribute, and the content goes in between the opening and closing tags. Let's create 3 steps we can all relate to. That is the checkout process of an e-commerce site. So step 1 is going to be for shipping address. Step 2 for billing address. And step 3 for placing an order. If you now save the files and take a look at the browser, you should be able to see the horizontal stepper. We have 3 steps. Each step has a label and a numeric value indicating the step. You can click on the label to navigate to the particular step. Once you navigate away though, the icon changes from the numeric value to the edit icon. So this stepper basically gives you an idea of your progress through the checkout process. Right now, we are navigating to the different steps by clicking on the label. However, stepper also supports a previous and next button out of the box. All you have to do is include the mat stepper previous and mat stepper next directives. So for the billing address step, let me add both these buttons. Button back, this is going to be mat button for styling, and then mat stepper previous to go back 1 step. Similarly, we have the next button. If we now go back to the browser, we should have these 2 buttons under billing address. If I click on back, we go back 1 step. And if I click on next, we go forward 1 step. So these are the stepper buttons. Next, let's talk about linear steps. If you have noticed, we can jump from step 1 to step 2 and then to step 3 without any restrictions. In certain situations though, you want the user to complete a step before they can proceed with the subsequent steps. Linear steppers are meant exactly for that. To convert a regular stepper into a linear stepper, there are two steps. The first step is to add the linear attribute to the mat horizontal stepper component. Linear. The second step is to add a completed attribute to the individual steps. To each step, I will add the attribute and set it to false. If we now go back to the browser, I click on billing address and you can see that we are not navigated to step 2. Step 1 is not completed and hence we cannot proceed. If I change step 1 completed to true, you can see that now we can proceed to step 2. And since step 2 is not completed, we cannot proceed to step 3. Now for this example, I am hard coding true or false, but ideally you need to have property binding with this completed property. Based on your requirements, after the user interacts with the step, call a method that will update the completed property to true, which will then allow the user to navigate to the next step. And if at all you do have a step which is optional, you can simply place the optional attribute on that particular step. On step 2, I will add the attribute optional. And now if you go back to the browser, you can see that we can navigate all the way to step 3, even though we have completed attribute set to false for step number 2. You can also see the optional text being displayed for billing address. Alright, what we have seen is a horizontal stepper. You can also create vertical steppers with Angular material. Simply change mat horizontal stepper to mat vertical stepper. And you can see that we have the exact same stepper, but this time with vertical orientation. Well, that is about components related to layout in Angular material. Starting next video, let's take a look at components related to forms. In this video, let's take a look at the components related to an input in Angular material. When it comes to controls like inputs, text areas, and select, we always discuss them in relation to a common wrapper component, and that is the form field component. So when you talk about an input component, you're effectively talking about the form field component and the input component. Let's take a closer look at both those components in this video. The first step is to import the two concerned modules. So in material.module.ts, I'm going to import mat form field module and mat input module. Make sure to add them to the material array as well. Now we can create our first input control. So in app.component.html, I'm going to add mat form field, and within these tags, I'm going to add input with a mat input attribute. Please make note that every input element has to have this form field wrapper. And to the input element itself, we add the mat input attribute. Now if I save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have the most basic material input element. Let's see how we can customize this input control. First up, let's see how to add a label to the input field. Now to add a label, use the mat label component. So within the mat form field opening tag, mat label, and let's call this name. If you take a look at the browser, you can see the label. It behaves as a placeholder when there is no text. Start typing and the label floats to the top. And this is the default behavior. We can of course change this. So on the form field, make use of the float label attribute to control the behavior of the label. So float label can be set to never, in which case the label will not float and is hidden when you type something. You can also set it to always, in which case the label is floating even when there is no text in the input. And you can also set it to auto, which is the default value. Another important point is how the label is presented for a required form field. So if I mark the input element as required, you can see that now the label has the asterisk automatically appended. No additional styling is required. If you want to disable this behavior, you can make use of the hide required marker attribute on the form field. So hide required marker. If I go back to the browser, the asterisk is not present for a required field. The next thing we can do with the form field is setting a hint label. For that, we make use of the mat hint component. So within the form field, I'm going to add mat hint, and let's have min 5 characters. If you take a look at the browser, you can see that the hint is placed right below the input. And by default, it is left aligned. We can right align it using the align attribute and setting it to a value of end. So mat hint align is equal to end. If you go back to the browser, you can see that the hint is now right aligned. Next, let's talk about appearance. We can control the appearance of the form field using the appearance attribute. By default, the appearance has a value of legacy, which is what we've seen so far. So appearance is equal to legacy. We also have an appearance value of standard, and this is just an updated version with more consistent spacing. So I'm going to copy, paste it, and change appearance legacy to standard. If I save this and go back to the browser, you can see that there is slight difference in how the spacing is for the standard appearance. Now we have two more appearances, fill and outline. So this is going to be fill, and this is going to be outline. The fill appearance displays the form field with a filled background, and the outline appearance shows the form field with a border all the way around and not just an underline. So if I go back to the browser, you can see that we have a filled input element, and then we also have one which has border all the way around. So this is fill and this is appearance outline. Finally, let's discuss about theming. By default, the colors reflect the primary color of the theme. We can set the color attribute to accent and also worn if required. So on the form field, color is equal to accent, and on this one, color is equal to worn. If you now take a look at the browser, the first control is accent themed and the second is warning themed. Now, on a side note, please go through the documentation on how to incorporate error messages with form fields. It requires a bit of knowledge on Angular Forms concepts, which I will not be covering here. But the documentation is pretty clear, so you should be in a good position. Alright, that is about the input control wrapped inside a form field component. In the next video, let's take a look at the select control. In this video, let's take a look at the material select component, which is a form control for selecting a value from a set of options. The first step is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, we're going to import mat select module and add it to the material array. Now we can create our first material select component. The material select component, just like the input component, has to be wrapped inside the form field component. So mat form field. Now the component for a select control is mat select. Within the select component, we add a label using the mat label component. The label is going to be topic. Every option for this select control is specified using the mat option component. So mat option. And let's create 3 of them. Each option will have the inner text which the user can see and a value which is sent to the server. So we are going to have Angular, React, and Vue all in title case, which can be seen in the browser, and the same all in lowercase as the corresponding value which will be sent to the server. So mat option value is equal to Angular, value is equal to React, and value is equal to Vue. So we have the label and the 3 options. And there is a small correction. The label has to be outside the mat select component. So the label goes inside mat form field. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a basic material select control. The label is shown by default, and when you select a value, the label floats to the top. Now we have already discussed the features of the form field component, about labels, about hints, appearance, and theming. So I'm not going to demo them again in this video. Instead, we are going to focus only on the select component. The first thing you might want to do is track the value of the select control. And that can easily be done using two-way binding. So back in VS Code, in the component class, create a new property called selected value. This is of type string. Next, in the HTML, we two-way bind to that property. So on mat select, we are going to add two-way binding, so banana in a box. Value is what we bind to. This is going to be equal to selected value. To view the value in the browser, let's interpolate it. Now, if we take a look at the browser, we don't have a value displayed. Select a topic, and its corresponding value is displayed. The value displayed reflects the value attribute in the HTML. Sometimes you might want an option to clear out the selected value. In such a scenario, use an option with no value attribute. So we are going to add another option, mat option, and the text is going to be none, and there is no value attribute. So now if you go back to the browser, select a value, and the value is displayed. Select none, and the value is reset. The next feature possible with material select is grouping related options under a particular subheading. And for that, we make use of the material option group component. So back in VS Code, I'm going to replace the existing options with a set of options that are saved in my clipboard. So what we now have is mat option for none, and then we have mat option group component with a particular label. Now this is the label that groups these three mat option components. So Angular, React, Vue will be displayed under a label of web, and similarly Ionic and React Native will be displayed under the category label of mobile. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we now have the topics grouped under a subheading. We have none, we have web which cannot be selected, and then we have the options under web, Angular, React, and Vue. Similarly, we have mobile, which is the label that can't be selected, and under mobile we have Ionic and React Native. So that is about grouping together the options. And it is also possible to allow multiple selections. All we have to do is add the multiple attribute on the select component. So on mat select, add multiple. Now if we take a look at the browser, the options turn into checkboxes and you can toggle selection on multiple options. So we now have Angular and React, and the corresponding value is displayed. Alright, those are some of the properties of Angular Material's select component. And the reason I code the options line by line and not use an ng-for directive is simply because ng-for is not an Angular Material concept. I want to help you understand the possibilities with Angular Material, and how you want to use it or improve it is completely up to you. So in the next video, let's take a look at autocomplete in Angular Material. In this video, let's take a look at autocomplete in Angular Material. Step 1, as always, is to import the appropriate module. So in material.module.ts, we import mat autocomplete module and add it to the material array. Now we can create our first autocomplete. Let's go back to the HTML and start off with a form tag. Within the form tag, mat form field, an input element, type is equal to text, and add the mat input attribute. If we save this and take a look at the browser, we should have a basic input element. The next step is to create a list of options that need to be displayed as autocomplete options. So in the component class, I'm going to add 3 options. Angular, React, and Vue. The next step is to make use of the autocomplete component to display this list of options. The component for autocomplete is mat autocomplete. So right after the input element, mat autocomplete. To specify the options, we use the mat option component. And to iterate over the list of options, we will be using the ng-for directive. So on mat option, ng-for is equal to let option of options. We are also going to have property binding to value. This is going to be equal to option, which is from the current iteration. And we are going to display the option. So basically the value and what we display is going to be Angular, React, or Vue. Alright, now we have an input element and an autocomplete with options. The final step is to link the two together. On the autocomplete component, we add a reference variable and assign to it mat autocomplete. On the input element, we add the mat autocomplete property and bind it with the reference variable. So this is going to be equal to auto. This right here. If we now save the files and take a look at the browser, I click on the input element and we get the list of options: Angular, React, and Vue. Click on an option and it fills the value for us. So we have a basic autocomplete up and running. Now it's also quite possible that your list of options is not simply an array of strings. Instead, it could very well be an array of objects. For example, an array of 4 objects which has key value pairs. So I've copy pasted a new array called object options, which is an array of 4 objects. Each of the objects have name, Angular, Angular Material, React, and Vue. Now, to display the options correctly, in the HTML, we interpolate option.name. Name is a property in each of these objects. And of course, make sure to iterate over object options now. If we now save the file and take a look at the browser, the options are displayed correctly, but when you select an option, the autocomplete doesn't display that value properly. To let the autocomplete know that it has to use the name property to display as value, you can specify a display function. So back in the component class, I'm going to define the display function. Display function, the function gets each object as a parameter. I'm going to call the parameter as subject. And if at all there is a subject, we return subject.name, else undefined. Now in the HTML, on the autocomplete component, we add the display with directive and assign the function. If we now take a look at the browser, the autocomplete works as expected. The display value is Angular, but the selected value from the autocomplete would be the entire object. Now this is great, but what you might be looking for is the filter autocomplete. As you start typing in the text, the options are narrowed down. Now this is where things start to get a little complicated. To be able to implement a filtered autocomplete, you need to have a decent knowledge of Angular Forms. Angular Forms is out of scope for this series, but you can find the complete series on Angular Forms on my channel. If you feel lost, please go through that series and then try to understand how a filtered autocomplete works. Alright, the first step is to import reactive forms module and add it to the imports array. So in app.module.ts, import reactive forms module from Angular/forms and add it to the imports array. Step 2, create a form control and link it to the input element. So in app.component.ts, which is the class component, we're going to import form control from Angular/forms and create a new form control. So in the class, my control is equal to new form control. And on the input element, form control is going to be equal to my control. So we created the form control and linked it to the input element. Third step, we use the help of RxJS to create a filtered list of options. So in app.component.ts, begin by making the necessary imports. We need observable from RxJS and map and start with operators from RxJS. Next, we need a new property. This is going to be filtered options. This is going to be an observable of an array of strings. Next, we need to implement the ng-on-init lifecycle hook. So from Angular/core, I'm going to import on-init, and app component is going to implement on-init. And we can now define the lifecycle hook. So ng-on-init. And within this method, we are going to have this dot filtered options equal to this dot myControl dot value changes dot pipe start with anything and then map accepting the value this dot filter out the options based on the value. And then we can define the filter function. So private filter is going to accept a value of type string and return an array of strings. Over here, I'm going to have const filter value is equal to value dot to lowercase, and then return this dot options dot filter is going to accept an option and check if option dot to lowercase dot includes the filter value. So what is happening here is that whenever the input value changes, this code right here is called, and in the filter method we accept the filter text and check if the option includes that filter text. If it does, it returns true and gets displayed. If not, the option is hidden in the autocomplete. The final step is to iterate over this filtered options in the HTML with the async pipe. So ng4 let option of filtered options with the async pipe. And of course, this needs to be just option. If we now take a look at the browser, we should have a working filter autocomplete. Again, if it seemed a bit hard to understand, please do make sure you go through the concepts in Angular and then revisit this video. Angular material checkboxes and radio buttons behave exactly the same as native checkboxes and radio buttons. The only difference is the styling and animations that are part of the material library. Let's begin with checkboxes. The first step is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, import mat checkbox module and add it to the material array. Now we can add a material checkbox in the HTML. The component for a checkbox is mat checkbox, and the content between the tags is treated as the checkbox label. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a checkbox which behaves exactly like a regular checkbox, but this time we have the addition of styling and animation. By default, the label is positioned to the right of the checkbox, but we can position it to the left using the label position attribute. So back in the HTML, I'm going to duplicate this and set label position is equal to before. I'm also going to add a break tag. Now save this and take a look at the browser, and you can see that the label is on the left hand side. Also, if you can notice, by default the theme or color of the checkbox is the accent color. You can change it to primary or worn using the color attribute. So I'm going to create two more checkboxes. On the first one, I'm going to set color is equal to primary, and on the second one, color is equal to worn. Now back in the browser, you can see that the first two checkboxes have an accent theme, the third checkbox has a primary theme, and the last checkbox has a worn theme. And that is all there is to customize the checkbox in Angular Material. Native checkbox with styling and animations. Now let's take a look at Angular Material radio buttons. Again, they're basically native radio buttons with material styling and animations. As always, the first step is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, we're going to import mat radio module and also add it to the material array. Now we can add radio buttons in the HTML. There are two main components that we deal with: radio group and radio button. Radio buttons are usually placed inside the radio group component. So start off with mat radio group, and within the radio group we add the radio buttons. Mat radio button, I'm going to make two more copies of this. The first one, value is going to be Angular, label is Angular, second one is React, and finally Vue. Now if we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see the three radio buttons: Angular, React, and Vue. Again, by default, the color of the radio button is set to accent color of the theme. You can change it using the color attribute. For the first radio button, I'm going to add color is equal to primary. And for the third button, color is equal to worn. Now, if we take a look at the browser, the first one has a primary color, the second one by default has an accent color, and the third one has the worn color. Alright, that is pretty much about radio buttons in Angular material. Now, if you want to access the value of either the checkbox or the radio buttons, you can do it with two-way binding. Make sure to import the forms module and use the banana in a box syntax for two-way binding. For a detailed explanation, please go through the Angular Forms tutorial on my channel. You will find everything there is to know about form controls in that series. In the next video, let's discuss about the date picker in Angular material. In this video, let's take a look at the date picker component in Angular material. To start off, in material.module.ts, we need to import mat date picker module and mat native date module from Angular/material. After importing, add them to the material array. Now we can create our first date picker. A date picker is basically composed of a text input and a calendar pop-up. In the HTML, we are going to start off with a form field. So mat form field, and within the form field component, add an input element with mat input attribute. For this input element, we are going to attach an icon which will open the calendar pop-up. The component for the icon is mat date picker toggle, and we will add the mat suffix attribute. Now that we have the input and a date picker toggle, we now need the actual date picker component. The component to use is mat date picker. And now the final step is to link all the three together. On the date picker, create a reference variable, my date picker. On the input element, add the mat date picker property and bind it with the reference variable, my date picker. Finally, on the date picker toggle, add the for property and bind to the reference variable again, my date picker. If we now save the files and take a look at the browser, we should have an input element suffixed with an icon. When you click on the icon, a calendar pops up with today's date selected. When you click on the date, the value is saved to the input element. You can also go back and forth between different months, or also directly jump to a particular year. You can even enter a date in the input element. Let's go with April 6th, 2019. And you can see that the date is selected. So this is a basic date picker in Angular material. Now let's take a look at the different configurations possible for this date picker. The first one is regarding the starting view of the calendar. By default, it will open the month view. We can change it using the start view property. So on the mat date picker component, start view, and you can set this to year, in which case it displays the months of the year, or you can also set it to multi-year, in which case it displays multiple years. Another typical requirement when working with date pickers is setting a minimum and maximum date that the user can select. We can easily do that with the min and max properties. I'm going to remove this start view property, and in the component class I will create two date objects. Min date is today's date, and max date is 2019-3-10. The parameters are year, month, and date. Also, please make a note that the month starts from 0. So we have the max date set to April 10th, 2019. Now that we have the min and max dates, we can bind it to the input component on the min and max properties. So on the input element, min is going to be equal to min date, and max is going to be equal to max date. If we now take a look at the calendar, you should be allowed to select dates starting from today's date till April 10th. You will not be able to select any other dates. Now, another requirement sometimes is when you have to filter out certain dates. For example, let's say a user should not be able to pick Saturdays and Sundays. You can do that by using the mat date picker filter property of the date picker input. So in the component class, you will need to create a filter function. Date filter is going to accept date, and then we are going to create const day is equal to date.getDay to extract just the day, and then we return day is not equal to 0 and day is not equal to 6. We are basically preventing Saturdays and Sundays from being selected. Now in the HTML, on the input element, I'm going to remove min and max and set mat date picker filter is equal to our function date filter. If we now go back to the calendar, you can see that all the Saturdays and Sundays are disabled. You can select only the weekdays. Alright, that is pretty much the basics of date picker in Angular Material. Let's take a look at tooltips in this video. To get started, let's import the tooltip module. So in material.module.ts, import mat tooltip module and add it to the material array. Next, in the HTML, let's create a simple button and then associate a tooltip with that button. Button, the text is going to be hello. We're going to add mat raised button as an attribute for styling. And then for the tooltip, we add mat tooltip. This is going to be equal to welcome to code evolution. If we save this and take a look at the browser, you can see that when I hover on the button, we get the tooltip. Welcome to code evolution. Now by default, the position of the tooltip is to the bottom of the element, that is below the element. The position can be controlled using the mat tooltip position attribute. You can specify before, after, above, or below. Let's go with mat tooltip position is equal to after. If we save this and go back to the browser, you can see that the tooltip is placed after the button element. Now if there is no space, the tooltip is placed in the opposite direction. For example, if I specify above, in the browser, there is no room for the tooltip to be placed above, so the tooltip is placed below. And if I specify before, there is no space to the left, so it would be placed after, which is to the right. It is also possible to add delays for showing and hiding the tooltip. Sometimes the user might be just moving their mouse around and you don't want the tooltip to pop up. So adding a delay really helps in those situations. We make use of show delay and hide delay attributes. Let's add a 2-second delay. Mat tooltip show delay is equal to 2 seconds and mat tooltip hide delay is equal to 2 seconds. Now if you go back to the browser, there should be a delay in the show and hide of the tooltip. So hover on the button, 1, 2, and it shows up. Move your mouse away, 1, 2, and it is hidden again. Typically, a show delay of 600 milliseconds should be good. You wouldn't really need a high delay, but again, it completely depends on your requirement. So that is about tooltips in Angular Material. Let's take a look at Snackbar in the next video. In this video, let's take a look at snackbars in Angular Material. Snackbars are basically like notifications that inform users of some operation that has been performed. They appear for a short duration at the bottom of the screen and they don't require user input to disappear. And at any point in time, only one snackbar notification may be displayed. Let's begin by importing the module. So in material.module.ts, import mat snackbar module and add it to the material array. Now in our HTML, let's add a button that will open the snackbar. So button, add the mat button attribute and handle the click event. On click, we will call a method called openSnackbar, passing in a string item deleted as argument. The button text is going to be show snackbar. So we now have a button that calls the openSnackbar method. Let's go to the class component and define that method. To open a snackbar, we need to make use of a service. And that service is mat snackbar from Angular/material. So go ahead and import it. And once you import it, inject it in the constructor. Constructor private snackbar of type mat snackbar. Now we can define the openSnackbar method which will actually open the snackbar. So openSnackbar accepts a message and within the body we use the service instance and call the open method passing in the message. So the service instance is this.snackbar and we call open passing in the message. If we now save all the files and take a look at the browser, we should have a button, and when I click on the button, the snackbar should pop up at the bottom of the screen with the message item deleted. So we have a basic snackbar working as expected. Apart from the message, we can also specify an action for a snackbar. The action is specified as the second argument to the open method on the service instance. To keep the openSnackbar method more generic, I will pass the action parameter as well from the click handler. So in the HTML, the second parameter is going to be the string dismiss. In the component class, the method will now take a second parameter, which is action, and the same is passed to the open method. If you now take a look at the browser, click on the button, a snackbar opens and you can see the message item deleted and the action dismiss. When I click on this action, by default it closes the snackbar. A typical use case for this type of snackbar is usually to undo an operation. For example, let me rename the button to delete and the action to undo. But when the user does click on this action, we want to execute some code that will undo the operation. The way we are alerted when the snackbar is dismissed or the action is clicked is by using observables. So in the component class, we are going to start off by storing a reference to the snackbar that has been opened. So let snackbar ref is equal to this.snackbar.open. Now using this reference, we can subscribe to the after dismissed or on action observables. So the first one is after dismissed. So snackbar ref dot after dismissed dot subscribe, and we are going to basically log the statement the snackbar was dismissed. Similarly, we also have snackbar ref dot on action dot subscribe, and over here we are going to log the statement the snackbar action was triggered. If we now go back to the browser and open DevTools, click on the delete button and click on the action, we can see the log statements in the console. Action was clicked and the snackbar was dismissed. I just have console log statements, but you can have the code to undo the deletion. So we have the message and the action which are passed to the open method. There is also a third parameter which accepts some configuration. The one which would be used mostly is the duration property. The duration property indicates the length of time in milliseconds to wait before automatically dismissing the snackbar. I will add an object with the property duration and set it to 2000, which is 2 seconds. So comma, an object, duration set to 2 seconds. If we now go back to the browser, click on the button, the snackbar pops up, but after 2 seconds, it automatically dismisses. And in the console, you can see the log statement. So the after dismissed part of the code was executed when the snackbar was dismissed. So when you have an action, you can use the on action observable. And when you don't have an action, but want to execute some code when the snackbar is dismissed, place that code in the after dismissed observable. The last point to discuss is about the open from component method. As the name indicates, the open from component method creates and opens a snackbar with a custom component for the content. Let's take a look at an example. In the existing component class, which is app.component.ts, I'm going to quickly copy paste another component. Now you could create the component in a separate folder, but for simplicity, I have it right here. As you can see, the template is a span tag with color set to orange. Now in the app module, I will add the component in the declarations array and add to another property called entry components. Alright, now that we have a component to display as custom content, let's add a button and a click handler to open the snackbar. So in the HTML, button, mat button, click handler, it is going to be open custom snackbar. The text is going to be show custom snackbar. And in the component class, we're going to define open custom snackbar. And this is basically going to be this.snackbar.open from component. We pass in the custom component as its first argument. And then we pass in duration of 2 seconds. If we now go back to the browser and click on show custom snackbar, we should have our orange colored notification. Custom snackbar. Alright guys, in this video, we are going to take a look at dialogues in Angular material. A dialog is a type of modal window that appears in front of the app content to provide information or ask for information. The usage of a dialog is very similar to that of the Snackbar component we looked at in the last video. So this video should be pretty straightforward if you've understood how a Snackbar works. Alright, let's get started. First step, import mat dialog module and add it to the material array. Next, in the HTML, create a button that can open the dialog. So button, add the attribute mat raised button, add a click handler which is open dialog, and then the button text is going to be open dialog. Now let's define the open dialog method. To be able to actually open the dialog, we need the mat dialog service. So import mat dialog from Angular/material. After importing, we need to inject it. So constructor, let's go with public dialog of type mat dialog. And then we can define the open dialog method. Within the body, we are going to have this .dialog.open, and the open method on dialog accepts two parameters. The first parameter is a component and the second parameter is optional configuration. To pass in a component parameter, let's first create it. So in the terminal, we use Angular CLI and run the command ng g for generate, c for component, and the name of the component, which is going to be dialog-example. And I'm also going to skip the test files. The command creates a folder for the component and adds it to the app module. But a component that is used for a dialog also has to be included in the entry components array. So over here, dialog example component. Now we can pass this component as our parameter. So nav.component.ts, this .dialog.open, and the first parameter is going to be dialog example component. Alright, let's go back to the browser and test this out. If I click on the button, a dialog pops up with the content dialog example works. And this is the HTML corresponding to our dialog example component. Right now, we just have a paragraph tag, but there are several directives meant specifically to structure the dialog content. Let's use them instead. So in VS Code, I'm going to open the file dialogexample.html. And first, we specify a dialog title using the mat dialog title directive. So I'm going to add an h2 tag, and the directive is going to be mat dialog title. This is going to be session timeout. Next, for the content, we have mat dialog content. So this is going to be mat dialog content. And the text is going to be, you will be logged out due to inactivity. Next, for the dialog action, we have the mat dialog actions. Let's create two buttons, one to stay signed in and one to log out. So keep me logged in or log out. Now on both these buttons, if you want the click event to close the dialog, we need to add the mat dialog close directive. So on both the buttons, mat dialog close. Alright, let's test this out. If we go back to the browser and I click on the button, we have the modal with the title, content, and the buttons. When I click the button, it closes the dialog as well. Now we have two buttons intended for different purposes. How would we know whether to log the user out or keep them signed in when the dialog closes on the button click. We can do that using the after closed observable, which conveniently returns a result. So back in VS Code, in the component class, first create a reference to the dialog. So let dialog ref is going to be this.dialog.open. Now we can subscribe to the observable. Dialog ref dot after closed dot subscribe. We get a result, and let's simply log that to the console. Dialog result is result. Finally, we assign a value to the mat dialog close directive, which is accessed as the result. So in the HTML for the dialog, on keep me logged in button, mat dialog close is going to be equal to true for the first case and false for logout. Let's go back to the browser and test this out. I'm going to open the console, click on open dialog, and click on keep me logged in. You can see that it says dialog result true, and click on logout, it says dialog result false. So in the subscription method, you can have the code that checks for the result. If result is equal to true, keep them signed in, and if result is equal to false, log them out. The final point to discuss with dialogs is passing in the data to the dialog component. Now there are a couple of steps, so let's go over each of them. The first step, specify the data as the second parameter to the dialog open method. So this is going to be an object. The key is going to be data, which in turn is going to be an object. I'm going to pass a name called Vishwas. So this is the second argument to the open method. Next, open the component class for the dialog example component. So dialog example component.ts. To access the data in the dialog component, we have to use the mat dialog data injection token. So first import inject from Angular/core. Next, import mat dialog data from Angular/material, and then we inject it in the constructor. So constructor is going to be @inject, and we are injecting mat dialog data, and then we say public data of type any. So basically we are now making the dialog component capable of receiving any type of data. Now in the dialog component HTML, we can simply interpolate the data object. So in mat dialog content, I'm going to add hi data.name. If you now go back to the browser and click on open dialog, you can see that the content says, hi Vishwas, you will be logged out due to inactivity. So we are able to pass data to the dialog component. Now if you want to specify height and width for the dialog, it can be passed into the configuration object. There are a bunch of properties you can use based on your requirement, so I'll leave that for you guys to explore. Browse the API tab in the documentation and you will find everything you need. Alright, I hope you now have a good understanding of how to work with dialogues in Angular Material. Alright, in this video, let's take a look at implementing a basic data table in Angular Material. The first step, as always, is to import the module. So in material.module.ts, import mat table module and add it to the material array. Now, what we are going to do to save us some time is copy the code for a basic data table and then understand the different parts that are responsible for the functioning of a data table. So in the material docs, go to Components and then to the Data Table section and click on the Table link. Over here in the Examples tab, we have a basic data table. Now go to the second example, which is basic use of mat table and uses display flex, and click on the code icon. Now let's copy paste the code. First, the HTML. So copy and paste it in app.component.html. Next, the TypeScript file. So go to TS, copy the interface and the data. In app.component.ts, paste it right after the import statement. Then go back to the documentation and copy the 2 lines of code from the component class. Go back to VS Code and in app component, paste them. Finally, copy the CSS. So over here, CSS, and then copy this and paste it in app.component.css. Now, if we save all the files and take a look at the browser, you should be able to see a data table. Now, let's understand the different parts that make up this data table. The first part to implementing a data table is the data source. Every data table needs a data source that contains the data to be displayed. In our example, we have the data of periodic elements. We have an interface that defines the type of each element. So a periodic element will have a name, position, weight, and symbol. Right below the interface is where you see the array of periodic elements. We have 10 elements, each having properties mentioned in the interface. What you have to notice here is that the interface and the data array is declared outside the component. To be able to use it in the component, we need to create a property and initialize it. For that purpose, we have data source, which is initialized to element data. This array right here. Alright, the next thing to do is to provide this data source to the data table. And we do that in the HTML. So in app.component.html, we create a data table with mat table component. And to provide the data source, we make use of the data source attribute. We use property binding to bind the property defined in the component class. So data source is equal to element data, which is provided here. So that is the first step to implementing a data table. Creating the data source and binding it to the table. The second step is to define the column templates. In the browser, you can see that we have 4 columns. The position number, name, weight, and symbol. In the code, we define the 4 columns, each inside its own ng container element. Position, name, weight, and symbol. The ng container element will not be rendered to the DOM, but it will provide an element for applying this mat column def directive. The mat column def directive is what uniquely identifies a given column with a key. Position, name, weight, and symbol. Inside the ng container element, we will have all the configuration for a given column. You can see that we have the template that defines how to display the header for a given column, identified using the mat header cell def structural directive. We also have another template that defines how to display the data cells of a given column using the mat cell def structural directive. The 2 structural directives do not attach any styling to the elements. The styling is taken care of by mat header cell and mat cell components. Next, let's talk about the content of the heading and the data cells. For the heading, you can see that we just have static text, number, name, weight, and symbol. But for the data cell, we get access to each row of the data source. We obtain a reference to each row and then access the different properties of each row. We then use interpolation to bind the data to the view. So in our data source, we have 10 rows. We iterate through the rows, get a reference to each row, and store it in the element variable. And then we access the appropriate property in the column template. So element.position, .name, .weight, and .symbol. These are the different properties for each element. Alright, now what we have done so far is just define the column template, how it's supposed to look. The final step is to define the rows in the data table. And for that, we make use of two more components. To define the table header row, we make use of the mat header row component. And to determine which columns have to be displayed in the table, mat header row def structural directive is used. To this, we assign displayed columns property, which is an array of columns we have mentioned in the component class. So displayed columns is an array of strings with position, name, weight, and symbol. Similarly, to display the data rows, we make use of the mat row component. Now, with mat row def structural directive, we also have a variable exported that we have named as row, containing the data of that given row, and we have to specify the columns property, which contains the order in which the data cells should be rendered. Again, this is displayed columns property. So when you run this code, we should have the data table working as expected. Position, name, weight, and symbol, and then the different rows corresponding to each entry or each item in the element array. So to summarize, there are 3 steps in implementing a data table in Angular Material. First step, define the data source and the columns to be displayed. Second step, define the column templates. And finally, the third step, include the header and the row definitions. So we are able to create a very basic data table. We copy-pasted the code and did not really code anything as such. So in the next video, let's also try to make some changes and see how that impacts the data table. That will give you guys a much better idea of how the data table works. In this video, let's take a more detailed look at data tables in Angular Material. And let's start with the displayed columns property. This property, as the name suggests, controls the columns to be displayed in the browser. As you can see, it is just an array of strings. If I were to, for example, remove symbol from this list, take a look at the browser, the column is not displayed. So the property controls which of the columns have to be shown. But there is more to it than just showing and hiding of columns. The order in which you specify the fields to be displayed is the order in which the columns are displayed in the browser. You can see that we have the order as position, name, weight, and symbol. And in the browser, the columns are in the exact same order. Position, name, weight, and symbol. If you want the weight column to be the last column, you just have to specify the weight column as the last column in displayed columns property. So I'm going to cut this out and paste it after symbol. If I now go back to the browser, weight is displayed as the last column. Which now brings me to the HTML to highlight another point. The order in which you specify these column templates with the ngContainer tag doesn't affect the order in any way whatsoever. The order is controlled by the displayed columns property, which is specified to the mat header row and mat row components. But what does matter with the container column template is the mat column definition attribute. The value has to be a value from the displayed columns property. If I were to change position to, let's say, position test, save and take a look at the browser, you can see that the code breaks and the data table is not displayed. So make sure you specify the right column name to the template. Next, let's talk about the mat row component. You can see that we have two variables declared, row and columns. The columns property is set to displayed columns to indicate what data has to be displayed. Let's change this and see what happens. So in the class component, I'm going to create another property called displayed columns data. And in this list, I'm going to remove weight. Also, back in the HTML, I'm going to set columns to displayed columns data. If you now take a look at the browser, you can see that we have only 3 columns of data being displayed and 4 columns of header. The data for the weight column is hidden. So it is very much possible to set separate columns to be displayed for the header and the data. But then again, not sure if you would ever want to do that. Next, let's talk about the row declaration. What this helps us with is to get hold of the row data to handle events on each row in that data table. For example, I can add a click event binding and call a method that provides us with the row data. Let's call this log data and pass in that row variable. Now in the component class, we can quickly define log data accepts a row, and let's just console log it. If I save the files and take a look at the browser, open console and click on a row, you can see the corresponding row data being logged in the console. So if you have any action that has to be performed, for example, editing, deleting, or navigating to a different route based on this row data, this is the way to go. Pass in the data, extract the ID, probably of that column, and perform the necessary action. Alright then, I hope that now you have a much better understanding of how a data table works in Angular Material. Next, let's take a look at filtering, sorting, and pagination in data tables. Features like filtering, sorting, and pagination have been made really simple in Angular Material. Let's take a look at filtering in this video, sorting and pagination in the subsequent videos. Filtering can be achieved in 3 simple steps. The first step is to create our data source as an instance of the mat table data source class. So let's begin by importing mat table data source from Angular Material. Next, we create our data source property as an instance of this imported class. So data source is going to be new mat table data source, and then we pass in element data as the argument. So that is our first step, creating the data source as an instance of the mat table data source class. Second step is to create an input field where the user can enter the filter text. Let's add that code in the HTML. Mat form field, then an input element. We add the mat input attribute and also a placeholder that says filter. Every time the user enters some text, we need to filter the data table. For that, we listen to the key up event. So key up, and on key up, we are going to call a method called apply filter. And to this method, we pass in the filter text, which is accessed using $event.target.value. That is the second step, creating a filter input. The final step is to define this apply filter method, which actually filters the data source. So back in the component class, apply filter accepts the filter text of type string, and within the method, all we have to do is assign the filter text value to the filter property of the data source. So this .dataSource.filter is equal to filter value .trim.toLowercase. Now this kind of seems like magic, but let me tell you how it works. Remember the mat table data source class that we imported? Well, that class has a property called filter. When you want to filter out the data, all you have to do is assign a string to that property. When you assign the filter value, the data source will reduce each row to a serialized form and will filter out the row if it does not contain that filtered value. Or to put it in simpler terms, does the data row contain the filter? If yes, only then display the row. So if you take a look at the browser, you can see that we have a filter input. I type H and you can see it filters the elements. Type HE and it filters further. I can also filter on numeric values. Type 6 and you can see it filters out the rows that don't contain the number 6. So 3 basic steps for filtering. Creating the data source as an instance of mat table data source, creating the input filter, and finally on key up of that input element, assign the filter value to the filter property of the data source. Alright, in the next video, let's take a look at sorting in data tables. In this video, let's take a look at sorting in data tables. Just like filtering, Angular Material makes it really simple to implement the sorting feature for your data table. Now there are 3 simple steps. The first step is to import the material sorting module. So in material.module.ts, we're going to import mat sort module and add it to the material array. Second step, we need to add directives to the material table in the HTML. So on the mat table itself, we need to add the mat sort directive. And to each column header cell that should trigger sorting, we need to add the mat sort header directive. Let's add it to the first 3 columns. So on mat header cell, mat sort header, and I'm going to add it to the next 2 columns as well. So on mat header cell, mat sort header, and the same again. The final step is to provide the mat sort directive to the data source. So in the TypeScript file, import mat sort from Angular/material. Next, we use the viewChild decorator to get hold of a reference to the mat sort component. So first, import viewChild from Angular/core. And then in the component class, at viewChild, mat sort of type mat sort. And finally, in the ngOnInit method, we assign the mat sort component to the sort property of the data table. So import onInit from Angular/core. App component implements onInit. And then we define ngOnInit. This .dataSource.sort is equal to this .sort. And that is pretty much it. Let's save the files and take a look at the browser. Now, when I hover on the column header, you can see an arrow mark. When I click on the header, the elements are sorted in ascending order. click on the header again, the elements are sorted in descending order. Click again, and the sorting is removed. Similarly, you can also sort on name and weight, ascending, descending, and no sort. The symbol column, on the other hand, is not sortable. That is because we did not attach the mat sort header directive to this column. So there you go, sorting data table in 3 simple steps. Include the mat sort module, add the directives in the HTML, mat sort header and mat sort, and finally assign the mat sort component to the sort property of the data source. In the next video, let's take a look at pagination. In this video, let's take a look at pagination in data tables. Similar to sorting, pagination can be implemented in 3 simple steps. The first step is to import the material paginator module. So in material.module.ts, import mat paginator module and add it to the material array. Second step, we add the paginator component in the HTML. So after mat table, mat paginator, and we are going to specify 2 options to the paginator. The first one is the page size. We specify that using the page size options property. Let's go with 5, 10, and 20. The second option is to show the first and last buttons of the paginator. Show first last buttons, and we simply include it as an attribute. The final step is to provide the mat paginator directive to the data source. So in the TypeScript file, import mat paginator from Angular/material, and then use the viewChild decorator to get hold of a reference to the mat paginator component. At viewChild mat paginator, the variable is going to be paginator of type mat paginator. Finally, in the ngOnInit method, we assign the mat paginator component to the paginator property of the data source. So this .dataSource.paginator is equal to this .paginator. And that is it. Let's save the files and take a look at the browser. At first glance, you can see that the styling is sort of broken, so let's fix that. In the HTML, we are going to wrap the table as well as the paginator in a div tag. And then we are going to move this elevation class from mat table to the div tag. Now, if you go back to the browser, you can see that it looks much better. By default, 5 items are displayed per page. You can change it to 10 or even 20. You can also go back and forth between the pages using the icon buttons. The first page and last page buttons might not be necessary for small data sets, but if you have several hundreds of rows with a small page size, you can definitely include the show first and last buttons attribute. Welcome back everyone. In this video, let's take a look at virtual scrolling with Angular CDK. Sometimes you might have to display hundreds or thousands of elements, which can be slow in any browser. Virtual scrolling will help you in such situations. With virtual scrolling, you can display large lists of elements performantly by only rendering the items that fit on the screen. Let's see how that can be done in this video. The first step, we need to import the scrolling module from Angular CDK. So in app.module.ts, import scrolling module from Angular/CDK/scrolling. Next, add it to the imports array. So scrolling module, add it to the imports array. Now, for the second step, we are going to create an array of 1,000 numbers. So in the component class, which is app.component.ts file, I'm going to create a new property, numbers, which is going to be an array. Then in the constructor, for let I equals 0, I less than 1000, I plus plus, this dot numbers dot push I. Alright, now that we have a huge list of numbers, let's render them in the HTML. I will first render them with the ng-for directive and then show you how it works with virtual scrolling. So in the HTML, add a div tag and then add the ng-for directive. ng-for is equal to let number of numbers. And then we simply render the number. I'm also going to add a bit of styling to this div tag. So open app.css and add a class called number with display flex, justify content center, align items center. Let's go with a border, 2 pixels solid maroon, and then box sizing, border box. And back in the HTML, I'm going to add the class number. Alright, if we now save the file and take a look at the browser, you should be able to see all the list of numbers. What I want to focus on though is the DOM itself. If I open DevTools, you can see that all of the 1,000 elements are present in the DOM tree. So this is the list with ng-for directive. Now let's implement the list with virtual scrolling. Back in the HTML, the first thing we have to do is create a viewport for the virtual scroll. The component is CDK virtual scroll viewport. On this viewport, we have to define the item size attribute. Now this is basically an indication of the size of each element. I have specified item size as 100, so in the number class as well, let's add height is equal to 100. Next, we need to specify a height for the viewport itself. And for that, I'm going to create a CSS class. This is going to be called container. And I'm going to set the height property to 400 pixels. And back in the HTML on the viewport, class is equal to container. Now each element is 100 pixels tall and the viewport is 400 pixels tall. So we should be able to see 4 elements at any given time. Back in the HTML, I'm going to move this div tag within the viewport. Now for the actual list of numbers, we do the same as what we did before with ng-for. The only difference now is that we are going to use CDK virtual for instead of ng-for. So CDK virtual for. This is the directive you have to make use of inside a virtual scrolling container. And that is pretty much it. If we now save the files and go back to the browser, we should only be seeing 4 elements at a time. And as we scroll down, we can see the rest of the elements. But what is important though is observing the DOM tree. You can see that instead of rendering all the 1,000 elements, we are now rendering only a handful of them. As you scroll, the DOM nodes update to reflect the numbers being displayed. So this way, we can implement a more performant list to display items. Alright, with that, we come to the end of this Angular material series. I hope you are now in a better position to start using some of the material components in your own projects.